The rain began the moment my car crossed the faded sign for Sorrow's Hollow. It wasn't a cleansing rain. It was a tired gray drizzle that seemed to seep from the very bones of the sky, a perpetual mourning for a sun long dead. It clung to the windshield like a cataract, blurring the edges of a world already dissolving into rot. The town itself was a study in decay. Victorian houses, once proud with their filigreed porches and towering gables, now sagged like old men with broken spines, their paint peeled in leprous patches, revealing the dark weeping wood beneath. Windows were hollow sockets, dark and vacant, staring out at streets paved with cracked asphalt and forgotten promises. A single blinking traffic light at the center of town pulsed a sickly yellow, casting jaundiced glances on empty sidewalks. There was no life, only the ghost of it. The air in Sorrow's Hollow tasted of rust and regret, of wet coal dust from a mine that had choked on its own darkness 50 years ago, and something else. Something older. The smell of damp earth, not from the rich soil of a forest floor, but the stale, close smell of a freshly opened grave. I had come here not by choice, but by a process of elimination. My life, the one I had meticulously built in the city, had crumbled into a pile of ash and whispers. Arthur Penhaligon, the celebrated investigative journalist, the man who spoke truth to power, that man was a phantom. What was left was a husk, hollowed out by a single shattering night of whiskey and twisted metal on a rain-slicked highway. The ghost of a little girl's face, pale in the flash of impact, was my constant silent companion, so I ran. I ran until the pavement ended, until the condescending pity in my friend's eyes was a distant memory. I ran to the forgotten corners of the map, seeking a place so dead it might make me feel alive by comparison. Sorrow's Hollow, with its morbid name and its reputation as a place where people went to disappear, seemed a fitting purgatory. I checked into the only lodging available, a grim boarding house called the Crow's Perch, run by a woman whose face was a roadmap of disappointments. Her name was Martha, and her silence was as heavy and grey as the perpetual sky. My room overlooked the town's centerpiece of desolation, the abandoned St. Giles Cathedral. It wasn't just closed, it was crucified. Its great stone body was pierced by the skeletons of scaffolding that had been left to rust for decades. One of its twin bell towers had partially collapsed, leaving a jagged maw that seemed to howl silently at the heavens. The stained glass windows were mostly gone, replaced by plywood or simply left as gaping holes through which the wind sang a mournful atonal hymn. It was from this window, on my third day of self-imposed exile, that I first learned the name Elias Thorne. His disappearance wasn't loud. In a town like Sorrow's Hollow, silence was the native tongue. It was a gradual realization, a slow dawning absence. The postman noticed the mail piling up. The proprietor of the general store noted he hadn't come for his weekly supply of cheap bourbon and canned beans. Sheriff Brody, a man who seemed as weary as the town itself, finally broke the seal on Elias's rented shack at the edge of the woods. I saw the commotion from my window, the slow, reluctant gathering of shadows that passed for neighbors. I was a journalist by instinct, a vulture drawn to the scent of a story, even a pathetic one. I grabbed my coat and descended into the drizzle. Sheriff Brody's face was a mask of practiced indifference, but his eyes, deep-set and shadowed, betrayed a tension that coiled in his gut. He was a big man, gone to seed, his uniform stretched taut over a belly that spoke of too many lonely nights with starch and grease. He saw me approaching, a stranger, a disruption to the town's delicate ecosystem of misery, and his posture stiffened. "Can I help you?" His voice was gravel scraped from the bottom of a whiskey barrel. I introduced myself, omitting the disgraced part of my journalist title. I told him I was writing a piece on forgotten American towns. It was a lie that tasted like truth. He grunted, a sound of profound disbelief. "Not much of a story here," he said, turning to go back inside. "Just a drunk who probably wandered off." But I saw it. On the splintered wood of the door jamb, a small, crudely carved wooden bird no bigger than my thumb. It was painted black, with a single stark white eye. It was facing the forest. I asked him about it. His face closed down, the shutter slamming shut. Local superstition means nothing. He was lying. The lie was as plain and ugly as the bird itself. The shack was a single room of squalor. A stained mattress on the floor, empty bottles standing like glass soldiers in every corner, and the sour stench of unwashed bodies and cheap liquor. But there was an order to the chaos. A small table in the center of the room was clean, almost reverently so. On it sat a single, half-finished carving of another wooden bird, identical to the one on the door, the knife lying beside it as if the carver had simply vanished mid-stroke. There were no signs of a struggle. The door had been locked from the inside, the windows were nailed shut. It was as if Elias Thorne had evaporated. Brody and his deputy, a jumpy young man who looked barely out of his teens, did a cursory search and declared it a simple missing persons case. But as they were leaving, the deputy nudged a loose floorboard with his boot. Brody shot him a look of pure venom, a silent, vicious command to leave it be. But I had seen it, and later that night, after the sheriff's car had gone and the shack was once again wrapped in the silence of the woods, I returned. The floorboard came up easily. Beneath it was not a stash of money or a bottle of prized liquor. It was a small, leather-bound book, a journal. Elias Thorne's handwriting was a frantic, spidery scrawl, the ramblings of a man teetering on the edge of sanity. But amidst the paranoid delusions and drunken diatribes, a pattern emerged. He wrote of a sound, a song, a lullaby that drifted from the Blackwood forest on moonless nights. He called it the Whistler's Tune. He wrote of a debt, an old debt the town owed. He wrote of the birds, calling them the eyes of the watcher, and claimed they were not carved but found. They appeared on the doorsteps of those who were chosen. The final entry was from 2 nights before he vanished. It was almost illegible. "The willow weeps for thee," it said. "He's calling my name. The ground remembers. The ground is hungry." My journalistic instincts, dormant for so long, flared to life. This was more than a drunk wandering off. This was a story. A dark, twisted story that coiled like a snake in the foundations of this miserable town. My investigation began at the only place that seemed to hold any answers, the skeletal remains of St. Giles. I had heard whispers of a priest who still lingered there, a man who refused to abandon the hollowed-out carcass of his faith. I found him in the nave, sweeping broken glass into piles with a quiet, meditative rhythm. Father Michael was not what I expected. He was young, perhaps only a few years older than me, with a face that was both handsome and deeply haunted. His eyes held a profound sadness, the look of a man who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. He didn't wear the traditional vestments, just a simple black cassock, frayed at the cuffs. He wasn't surprised to see me. "Another soul drawn to the quiet," he said, his voice soft yet resonant in the cavernous space. I told him about Elias Thorne, about the journal, about the lullaby. I expected denial, or perhaps a lecture on the dangers of local folklore. Instead, he just nodded slowly, his gaze drifting towards the shattered rose window above the altar. "The willow weeps for thee," he murmured. "An old song, a cradle song. They say it was sung to quiet the children during the Great Famine of 1888, a way to make them sleep without crying for food." He paused, his broom resting in his hands. "But some say it wasn't for the children. They say it was for something else. Something that woke up during the famine, something that fed on the town's despair." He led me down a rickety set of stairs into the crypt beneath the church. The air grew cold, thick with the smell of stone and time. The crypt was a labyrinth of crumbling arches and burial niches. In the center, illuminated by the weak beam of his flashlight, was a large, flat tombstone, its inscription worn away by centuries of damp. But carved into the stone was a symbol, a complex spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward. It was the same spiral I had seen in Elias Thorne's frantic drawings. "This town was not built on faith, Mr. Penhaligon," Father Michael said, his voice a low whisper. "It was built on a bargain. The first settlers, the ones who survived that first brutal winter, they didn't pray to God for salvation. They prayed to the earth, to the ancient spirit that slept beneath this valley." He ran his hand over the spiral. "They made a pact. Prosperity for sacrifice, a life for a life to keep the hunger of the land at bay. They sealed the pact with a ritual that has been forgotten, or perhaps merely suppressed. He told me the church was built directly over the site of the original pact, an attempt to sanctify the ground to contain the darkness. But the darkness, he said, was patient. It seeped through the stone. It poisoned the town's soul. The mine collapse in the 50s, the string of suicides in the 70s, the slow, inexorable decay. It was all the land calling in its debt. Elias Thorne, I asked, my own voice sounding small in the oppressive dark. Was he the sacrifice? Father Michael turned to me, and in the dancing flashlight beam, his eyes looked ancient. The ritual requires a willing vessel, a soul already broken, a life that will not be missed. Elias was a prime candidate. He was listening to the land's song. He was answering its call. The next few days were a blur of rain and growing dread. I spoke to other townspeople, or tried to. Mentioning Elias Thorne's name was like holding up a crucifix to a vampire. Faces shuddered, doors closed. The wall of silence was absolute. It wasn't just fear, it was a conspiratorial shared guilt. They knew, they all knew. They were accomplices in their own damnation. The only other person who would speak to me was Old Man Hemlock, the town eccentric. I found him sitting on a bench by the defunct railway tracks, whittling a piece of wood into a familiar shape. A black bird. He was a scarecrow of a man, with wild white hair and eyes that darted back and forth as if watching invisible things skitter at the edge of his vision. He was mad, but his madness had a terrifying clarity. "You hear it too, don't you, city man?" he cackled, not looking up from his work. "The whistler, in the woods. He plays the tune and the ground gets hungry. They fed it before. Fed it with the miners, trapped him down in shaft number 4, said it was a cave-in, but it wasn't. It was a tithe, a blood tithe. He held up the finished bird. Its single white eye seemed to stare right through me. He's marking the flock, one by one. Elias heard the tune. Now the bird is on his door. Soon it'll be on another. He pointed a trembling, dirt-caked finger at me. He likes new blood, fresh meat. Sleep offered no escape. It was a gateway. My dreams became a suffocating tapestry of Sorrow's Hollow and my own past. I was back in the car, the wheel slick in my hands, the scent of whiskey on my breath. But the road wasn't a highway. It was the main street of the town, and the figure caught in my headlights wasn't a little girl. It was Elias Thorne, his face a mask of terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. And from the dark woods that lined the road, I could hear a tune being whistled, a simple, haunting melody that promised oblivion. The lullaby, the willow weeps for thee, my dear. The soil is soft, the night is near. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the tune still echoing in the silence of my room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I started seeing things, a fleeting shadow in the corner of my eye, a face in the peeling paint of the wall, the wooden bird from Elias's doorjamb which I had taken and kept on my bedside table seemed to change. Some mornings I could have sworn its head was turned a slightly different angle, its painted eye fixed on me as I slept. I was unraveling. The town's madness was infectious, a fever seeping into my blood. I found myself listening, truly listening to the wind, half expecting to hear the whistler's tune. I started to understand Elias Thorne's paranoia. It wasn't paranoia if they were really out to get you. My investigation led me to the old town records stored in the damp, musty basement of the defunct town hall. It took a bottle of good scotch and a feigned interest in his war stories to get the key from the ancient clerk who guarded the place. The records were a disaster, a history written in mold and water stains. But I was looking for something specific. The mine collapse of 1957. The official report was brief, clinical. A methane explosion. 32 men lost. A tragic accident. But tucked away in a separate file, mislabeled as geological surveys, I found what I was looking for. A slim volume, a diary. It belonged to the mine foreman, a man named Jacob Miller. His entries from the weeks leading up to the accident were eerily familiar. He wrote of a growing unease among the men, of whispers about an old pact. He wrote of the mine owner, a man named Alistair Finch, the great-grandfather of the current largely absent town mayor, becoming obsessed with local folklore. He described Finch leading strange, torchlit gatherings near the oldest, deepest shaft, number 4. The final entry, dated the day before the explosion, was chilling. Alistair says the ground is thirsty. He says the prosperity of the last decade has a price. He's chosen the men, the ones with no family, the drifters. He says it is not murder, but a necessary sacrifice. He called it feeding the root. Tonight he seals the shaft. God forgive us all. It wasn't an accident. It was a mass murder, a human sacrifice on an industrial scale. Old man Hemlock was right. Armed with this knowledge, I confronted Father Michael. I found him again in the crypt, kneeling before the spiral-marked tomb. When I told him what I'd found, he didn't seem surprised. He simply looked up at me, his face etched with a weary resignation. "You see now," he said, "the sin of this town isn't just old, it's foundational. Alistair Finch renewed the pact his ancestors made. He bought another 50 years of quiet decay instead of catastrophic collapse. He fed the Whistler." "The Whistler?" I asked, the name from Hemlock's rant sending a shiver down my spine. "Is it a man? A ghost?" "It is neither," the priest replied, rising to his feet. "It is the land, the will of this place, the hunger. It doesn't have a body, so it borrows one. It doesn't have a voice, so it uses the wind and the memories of songs. It is a presence, an appetite, and it is waking up again. The 50 years are over. The debt is due." He then told me about the ritual, the real one. It wasn't just about sacrifice. It was about transference, a way to pass the mark, the focus of the Whistler's hunger from one person to another. It required specific artifacts, a specific location, and a specific incantation, the full lullaby, not just the fragments Elias had heard. He claimed the church was a sanctuary, the one place the Whistler's influence was weakest. But looking at him then, surrounded by the bones of the dead, his face illuminated by the sickly glow of his lamp, I wasn't so sure. He looked less like a warden and more like a keeper of secrets, a keeper of the faith. But which faith? That night, the second disappearance happened. A young woman named Sarah, a waitress at the town's greasy spoon diner. She was a quiet girl, haunted by a past of her own, a bad marriage she'd run away from, another broken soul, another life that wouldn't be missed. The pattern was the same. She vanished from her small apartment above the diner, locked door, nailed windows. And on her doorstep, Sheriff Brody found it, his face ashen in the pre-dawn gloom, a small black wooden bird. This time, however, there was something new. On the wall inside her room, drawn in what looked like lipstick, was a spiral, the same spiral from the tomb. The same spiral from Elias Thorne's journal. The town was no longer quiet. The silence had been replaced by a palpable vibrating terror. People locked their doors, peering out from behind grimy curtains. The air was thick with it. The Whistler was no longer whispering. It was beginning to scream, and everyone could hear it. I went back to my room at the boarding house, my mind racing. The journal, the diary, the priest's words. They were all pieces of a puzzle I couldn't assemble. I sat on my bed, staring at the wooden bird on my nightstand. In the dim light, I thought I saw it again. A flicker of movement. I picked it up. The wood was cold, unnaturally so. I turned it over and over in my hand, and then I saw it. A tiny, almost invisible scratch on its underside. It was a letter, Anna, for Arthur. My blood ran cold. I checked the other bird, the one from Elias's shack. On its underside was an E, and I knew with a certainty that defied all logic that the bird found at Sarah's apartment would have an S on it. They weren't just markers. They were invitations. They were claims. And a memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through the fog of my guilt. The night of the accident. The little girl's face, her name. It was Amelia. A. The first piece of the ritual had not been set in Sorrow's Hollow. It had been set a year ago on a dark highway by my own hand. My past wasn't just haunting me. It had followed me here, or worse, it had led me here. The rain beat against the window pane, and for the first time, clear as a bell on the wind, I heard it. A soft, melodic whistling drifting from the direction of the Blackwood Forest. The lullaby. It was no longer a vague and distant sound. It felt intimate. It felt like it was calling my name. The sound was insidious. It wasn't in my ears. It was behind them, a needle of ice tracing the pathways of my auditory nerves. The whistler's tune. It stripped the air of warmth, leaving behind the metallic taste of fear. I slammed the window shut, a futile gesture against a sound that was already inside me. The A on the bird felt like it was burning a brand into my palm. Arthur. Amelia. The two names were now fused, a single knot of guilt in my gut. My past was no longer a ghost. It was a hungry entity, and it had found a home in the soil of Sorrow's Hollow. I had to know more. I had to tear the silence from this town's throat. My first stop was Sheriff Brody. I found him at the diner, staring into a cup of black coffee as if it held the secrets of the universe. The place was empty save for the cook, a hulking man who moved with the slow, deliberate misery of a glacier. The air smelled of old grease and despair. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I dropped the mine foreman's diary on the table next to his coffee. The thud was loud in the silence. "Shaft number 4, I said, my voice low and hard. It wasn't a methane explosion. It was a blood tithe. You know it, don't you, Brody? Your whole damn town knows it." He didn't look at the diary. He just continued to stare into his cup. For a long moment, the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle hiss of the rain outside. When he finally looked up, the indifference was gone. His face was a wreck of exhaustion and a deep, ancestral fear. "My grandfather was on the schedule to work that shift," he said, his voice raspy. "He got a fever the night before, a bad one. His mother, my great-grandmother, she always said it was the grace of God that saved him." He let out a short, bitter laugh that had no humor in it. "But it wasn't God, was it? The Finches were trimming the herd. My grandfather was born here. His family was one of the originals. He wasn't expendable. The drifters, the outsiders, they were—" He finally picked up the diary, his thick fingers tracing the faded cover. "You think you've uncovered something new, Penhaligon? This is the bedtime story every child in Sorrow's Hollow grows up with. We don't talk about it, but we know. We know the ground we walk on is bought and paid for. We know the quiet we have is borrowed." His gaze met mine, and it was pleading. "Go home, you're a city man. You're poking a hornet's nest with a short stick. This thing, it doesn't just take people, it unravels them. It gets inside your head. You start seeing things that aren't there, hearing things. You start remembering things that never happened." I told him about the bird with my initial on it. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine shock in his eyes, quickly masked. "Leave it alone," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Some doors, once you open them, they can't be shut. Not ever." He slid the diary back across the table. "This never happened. I never saw this. You were never here." He stood up, put a few crumpled bills on the table, and walked out into the rain without another word, leaving me with the stench of his fear and the cold weight of his warning. Brody's complicity was a dead end. I needed another way in, another crack in the town's facade of secrets. My mind turned to the other derelict monuments that stood sentinel over the town's decay. The mine, the church, and the third point of this unholy trinity. The Blackwood Pines Sanatorium. It stood on a hill overlooking the town, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised purple of the sky. Its windows were like 1,000 broken teeth in a screaming mouth. Getting in was easy. The lock on the main gate was rusted through, and a side door had long since rotted off its hinges. The inside of the sanatorium was a symphony of decay. The air was a cocktail of mildew, antiseptic, and the faint cloying sweetness of rot. Moonlight filtered through grime-caked windows, illuminated peeling walls, overturned gurneys, and corridors that stretched into darkness like the gullets of dead leviathans. I found the records room in the basement. It was, miraculously, relatively dry. Metal filing cabinets stood in silent rows. I pulled open a drawer labeled Patient Admissions, 1,950 to 1,960 inches. My hands, slick with a cold sweat, trembled as I sifted through the brittle, yellowed files. I was looking for a connection, a thread to the mine disaster, and I found it. Dozens of them. In the year leading up to 1957, over 30 patients, all men, all listed as having no next of kin, were discharged. The reason for discharge was always the same: transferred to Finch Mining Company for vocational rehabilitation. It was a death sentence disguised as a prescription, but it was the medical notes that truly chilled me. I found the files of a Dr. Alistair Crane, the sanatorium's chief psychiatrist. His early notes were clinical, detached, but as the months wore on, his tone changed. He became less a doctor and more a terrified chronicler. He described a shared psychosis spreading through the wards, what he initially termed acoustic mimetic hysteria. Patients were fixated on a sound, a whistling lullaby they claimed to hear drifting from the woods at night. They drew pictures in their notebooks, over and over again, spirals, and black birds with single white eyes. Dr. Crane wrote, "They are not communicating this to each other. New admissions, held in isolation, begin describing the same tune, the same symbols within days of arrival. It's as if the illness is not in their minds, but in the air of this place. A genius loci, a spirit of the valley that preys on the fractured psyche. I fear we are not treating madmen. We are housing canaries in a coal mine, and they have all started to sing of the gas." The most damning discovery was Dr. Crane's personal log, a small black notebook tucked into the back of a filing cabinet. He described his growing horror as he realized Alistair Finch was cherry-picking his most isolated and disturbed patients for the work program. He wrote of confronting Finch, who had laughed in his face, calling it a symbiotic relationship. He does not see them as men, Crane wrote. He sees them as ingredients. He speaks of the land's appetite as one might speak of a furnace's need for coal. He believes he is not a murderer, but a high priest maintaining a delicate and terrible balance. Dr. Crane's final entry was dated 2 days after the mine collapse. "Finch visited me today. He did not threaten me. He didn't have to. He just smiled and said the valley was quiet now. He said my work here was done. He offered me a new position at a research facility out west. I know what this means. I am a loose end. I have heard the tune myself now. It is no longer just in the wind. It is in my blood. The willow weeps. I cannot remember the rest. I must get these notes out. I must hide them. The ground is hungry. God help me, the ground is hungry." Dr. Alistair Crane was officially listed as having resigned and moved away. Like Elias Thorne, he had simply vanished. I left the sanatorium as the first hints of a grey, hopeless dawn were staining the eastern sky. The knowledge I held felt toxic, a radioactive weight in my soul. This wasn't just a town with a dark secret. It was a cult, a generations-long cult that sacrificed the weak to appease a malevolent local deity. The Finches were the architects, Brody and the rest of the town were the silent congregation, and Father Michael. What was his role? The keeper of the law, the reluctant confessor? My thoughts were a maelstrom. The lines between my past and the town's present were blurring into a single terrifying narrative. The girl I killed, Amelia, was she just a random tragedy? Or was she the first note in a new composition of death, a prelude that had drawn me, the sorrow giver, to this specific stage? The psychological strain was becoming physical. Sleep was a battlefield I lost every night. The nightmares grew more vivid, more personal. One night, I dreamed I was in the crypt of St. Giles, standing before the tomb with the spiral. The stone slid aside, but there was no coffin beneath, only a dark earthen hole. From the hole, the whistling began, and a hand, caked in black soil, reached up and grabbed my ankle. I woke up gasping, my leg tangled in the bedsheets, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. On the floor beside my bed was a small clump of damp black earth. I hadn't been to the church grounds in days. The barrier between the dream world and the waking world was tearing. I started to see her. Amelia. Not in dreams, but in fleeting, waking moments. A glimpse of a small face in the reflection of a shop window. Gone when I turned. The shadow of a little girl darting down a rain-slicked alleyway. I knew it wasn't real. I knew it was my guilt, amplified by the oppressive atmosphere of this town, but the knowledge did nothing to lessen the terror. The Whistler, the entity, whatever it wasn't just taking people. It was using their own pain as a weapon against them. It found the cracks in your soul and poured itself in. The wooden bird on my nightstand became an object of obsessive focus. One afternoon, while staring at it, trying to will it to give up its secrets, I saw a single thick black tear well up from its painted white eye and roll slowly down its carved cheek. I flinched back, knocking the nightstand over. When I dared to look again, the bird lay on the floor, its face dry and inert, but the image was burned into my mind. I was losing my grip. The town was digesting me. Desperate, I went to the only person who had offered even a sliver of explanation. I went to Father Michael. I found him not in the church, but in the small rectory behind it, a sparse and lonely-looking cottage. He was seated at a heavy oak desk, surrounded by books that looked ancient. He didn't seem surprised by my frantic state. He listened patiently as I poured out everything: the sanatorium, Dr. Crane's diary, the disappearances of the patients, my hallucinations, the weeping bird. When I was done, a spent and trembling wreck, he simply nodded. "The entity uses what is already there," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the storm of my fear. "It feeds on regret, on sorrow, on guilt. It finds a host, a chosen one like Elias or Sarah, and it uses their despair to amplify its call. For you, it uses the memory of the girl. It is turning your own soul into a beacon to draw you closer to it." I asked him how to stop it. "You can't kill a hunger, Mr. Penhaligon," he said, rising from his desk. "You can't fight the land itself, but the old lore speaks of redirection, of severance. The ritual that the Finches bastardized was not originally about sacrifice, it was about transference. It was meant to take the mark from a chosen person and place it upon an effigy, a soulless object which would then be burned, satisfying the Whistler for a time." "Then we have to do it," I said, grabbing onto the hope he offered like a drowning man grabbing a rope. "For the next person, before it's too late." He looked at me, a long, searching gaze. "The ritual is dangerous. It requires a deep understanding of the forces at play. And it requires the full incantation, the true version of the lullaby." He walked to a locked chest in the corner of the room and took out a heavy, leather-bound book. It was far older than the one I'd found in Elias's shack. The leather was cracked and worn, and it was bound in what looked like tarnished silver. He opened it carefully. "The town only remembers fragments," he said. "But the church, my predecessors, we have kept the full knowledge. It was our duty to be the wardens of the cage." He turned the book towards me. The script was archaic, a spidery, elegant hand, and there it was. The Whistler's Lullaby, or the Song of the Root. The lyrics were not comforting, they were a set of instructions. "The willow weeps for thee, my dear. The soil is soft, the night is near. One soul of sorrow, steeped in sin, to call the hungry dark within. One bone of traitor, false and old, a story in the earth is told. One tear of watcher, born of fear, to make the unseen pathway clear. Upon the stone where bargains sleep, a promise that the ground must keep. Speak my name, the root sleeper deep, and give me all your pain to reap." It was a recipe for summoning, not banishing. When I pointed this out, my voice shaking, Father Michael looked at me with an expression of profound pity. "To redirect a force, you must first call it," he explained. "You must bring it to a focal point, bind it to your will, and then cast it onto the effigy. It is a razor's edge, Mr. Penhaligon. The slightest misstep, the slightest wavering of intent, and the Whistler will take the summoner instead of the offering." He told me the soul of sorrow was the catalyst, a person whose guilt was so profound it acted as a lure. "The Whistler has already chosen you as that lure, Arthur," he said, using my first name for the first time. "It has been priming you, using your grief, but we can use that. We can turn their weapon against them. You will be the bait, but I will be the one to spring the trap. I will guide you. I will protect you." It was a terrifying proposition, but it was the only path I could see that wasn't passive surrender. I agreed. The thought of being the bait was horrifying, but the thought of another person vanishing while I did nothing was worse. And perhaps, I thought with a desperate sliver of hope, if I faced this thing, if I offered up my guilt as a weapon, I could find some kind of absolution. He said the ritual had to be performed that night, a new moon. The time when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. The location had to be the nexus of power, the crypt, at the spiral-marked tomb, the stone womb from the lullaby. He gave me instructions. I was to bring the wooden bird, the one marked with my initial. It would serve as the effigy, the object onto which we would transfer the mark. He would gather the other components. He sent me away, telling me to prepare myself, to fortify my mind, to focus on my guilt not as a weakness, but as a shield. I spent the afternoon in a daze, the horrifying verses of the lullaby looping in my head. One soul of sorrow, steeped in sin, that was me. I was the key. As dusk fell, bleeding purple and orange bruises across the sky, I made my way to St. Giles. The air was unnaturally still. The rain had finally stopped, but the silence it left behind was heavier, more pregnant than the storm had been. Father Michael was waiting for me at the entrance to the crypt, holding a lantern. "Are you ready?" he asked, his face a pale mask in the flickering light. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. He led me down into the cold, damp dark. The tombstone in the center of the chamber seemed to pulse with a faint, cold energy. On top of it, Michael had arranged the other items. A shard of yellowed bone, a small vial filled with what looked like salt water, and a heavy ancient book, the one containing the true lullaby. "The bone of a traitor," he said, pointing to the shard, "from the grave of Alistair Finch, the tear of a watcher, born of fear." He held up the vial, collected from Martha at the boarding house, who watched Sarah walk towards the woods the night she vanished, and did nothing. He instructed me to place my wooden bird in the center of the spiral on the tomb. Then he told me to kneel. He began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, a guttural, ancient tongue that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The air grew colder. The flame in the lantern flickered wildly, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the stone walls. He told me to recite the first verse of the lullaby, to pour all my guilt, all my memories of the accident, of Amelia, into the words. I closed my eyes and spoke, my voice trembling. "The willow weeps for thee, my dear. The soil is soft, the night is near. One soul of sorrow, steeped in sin, to call the hungry dark within." As the words left my lips, a low humming sound began to fill the crypt. It wasn't coming from a single direction. It was coming from the stones themselves, from the earth beneath me. It was the whistler's tune, no longer a whistle, but a resonant, bone-deep thrum of power. "It is working!" Michael hissed, his eyes wide with a feverish intensity. "It feels your sorrow. It is coming." He gestured for me to continue, to remain focused, but a flicker of movement at the edge of the lantern light caught my eye. On the far wall of the crypt, a section of stone that had looked solid before now seemed to have a faint seam around it, a hidden door, and on that door, carved into the stone, were faded family crests. I recognized the Finch insignia, a bird of prey clutching a miner's pickaxe, and next to it another, a weeping willow entwined around a shepherd's crook. The O'Malleys, Father Michael's family. My focus shattered, the humming intensified, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. I looked at Michael, truly looked at him, and the pity in his eyes was gone. It had been replaced by something else. A cold, calculating piety, an ancient, terrible certainty. My gaze fell from his face to the book he held, the Book of Rites, and then to the wall behind him. I had been so focused on the tomb I hadn't seen it before. It was a chart etched into the stone, a complex web of names and dates, a timeline. I saw Finch Mine, 1957 to 32 souls. I saw Blackwood Pines Sanatorium, 1956 to 1957, 30-plus souls. Then a list of other names, other dates stretching back through the decades, and then I saw the recent entries scratched into the stone with something sharp and new. Elias Thorne, Sarah Peters, and above them another name with a date from a year ago. Amelia Vance. And there at the very bottom of the chart, waiting, was a final empty space. Below it, circled in a pigment that looked disturbingly like dried blood, was my name, Arthur Penhaligon. This wasn't a counter-ritual, it was the ritual. This wasn't a plan to save the next victim, it was the plan to create the next sacrifice. I wasn't the bait in a trap for the Whistler. I was the meal. The humming grew to a deafening roar, and the ground beneath my knees began to vibrate. The first twist of a key in a lock I never knew existed. Father Michael looked down at me, his face no longer that of a priest, but of an executioner. "The land requires a shepherd for its flock of sins, Mr. Penhaligon," he said, his voice cutting through the din, devoid of all warmth. "It requires a soul heavy enough to anchor it for another generation. A soul like yours, broken, guilty, perfect. Your tragedy wasn't an accident that led you here. It was your audition." He stepped back towards the hidden door. A heavy grinding sound echoed as he pulled a lever I hadn't seen. A stone slab began to slide across the entrance to the crypt, plunging the chamber into near-total darkness, save for the wild, dying light of the lantern on the floor. I was trapped, betrayed, not just a participant, but the designated centerpiece of a century-old horror. The lullaby was no longer in my head or in the stones. It was coming from my own throat, a choked, terrified whisper, as the darkness and the cold and the hunger of the earth rose up to claim me. Panic is a cold fire. It burns away reason, leaving only the raw, screaming nerve of survival. The grinding of the stone door sliding shut was the sound of my own tomb being sealed. The darkness that flooded the crypt was absolute, a physical weight that pressed in on all sides, suffocating and vast. The only light was the sputtering lantern on the floor, its flame casting my shadow, a monstrous, dancing giant, against the stone walls that were now my cage. The humming intensified, a vibration that shook my very bones, and within it the whistler's tune became hideously clear, a gleeful, predatory melody. Father Michael, no. The man was no priest, he was a jailer, a butcher, was gone. He had left me to my fate. He had not lied about the ritual, needing a soul steeped in sin. He had simply omitted the fact that my sin was not the fuel, but the final offering. My mind reeled, trying to process the betrayal. The gentle, haunted priest was a facade, a carefully constructed role played to perfection. His family, the O'Malleys, their crest was on the wall. They weren't just keepers of the law, they were active participants. Shepherds, he had called them, guiding the flock to slaughter. My eyes darted around the chamber, seeking an escape that I knew didn't exist. The sealed doorway, the solid stone walls, the oppressive weight of the church and the town, and a century of sin above me. I was trapped, and the presence in the crypt with me was growing stronger. It was a pressure in the air, a drop in temperature so profound that my breath plumed in front of my face like smoke. The earth beneath the tombstone seemed to breathe, a slow, deep inhalation. I scrambled backward away from the tomb, my back hitting the cold, damp stone of the wall. The sound of my own ragged breathing was loud in my ears, a counterpoint to the incessant, maddening lullaby. "Speak my name, the root sleeper deep," Michael's voice echoed in my memory. The final verse, the one he hadn't told me to say, the one that would complete the transference, not to the effigy, but to me. My gaze fell upon the wooden bird on the tombstone, the effigy, the one thing meant to save me now, a mockery of my gullibility. But as I stared at it, a desperate, insane thought sparked in the darkness of my mind. Michael had said the ritual required a willing vessel. Elias heard the call and answered it. Sarah, broken and lost, had likely done the same. They were chosen because they were already surrendered to their despair. But I was not surrendered. I was terrified, yes, but beneath the terror a hot, defiant rage was beginning to burn. Rage at Michael, rage at this town, rage at the entity that fed on misery, rage at myself for letting my guilt drag me into this trap. I would not be their sacrifice. I would not be the anchor for their damnation. If this ritual required my participation, my will, then I would deny it. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling. The humming grew louder, more insistent, as if sensing my defiance. A foul wind smelling of deep earth and decay swirled through the crypt, extinguishing the lantern, plunging me into a blackness so complete it was like being swallowed. The loss of sight was terrifying, but it sharpened my other senses. I could feel the presence now, a vast and ancient consciousness pressing against my own. It wasn't evil in a human sense, it was hunger, a geological, amoral, patient hunger. It probed my mind, searching for the cracks, for the guilt, for the sorrow of Amelia. It showed me her face, pale and bloodless in the glare of my headlights. It made me feel the sickening crunch of metal, the shattering of glass. It amplified my self-loathing, turning it into a deafening roar in my head. "Give in!" a voice whispered, a voice that was not a voice, but a thought planted directly into my brain. "Your pain will end. You will bring peace. You will be the foundation. You will be remembered." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. "No," I whispered into the suffocating dark. "I am not your foundation." I needed to disrupt the ritual. Michael had said the slightest misstep could cause it to fail, or worse, the components were on the tomb, the bone, the vial of tears, the effigy. I began to move, shuffling blindly through the dark, my hands outstretched, trying to remember the layout of the chamber. The humming grew dissonant, angry. The air crackled with a static charge. I felt a touch on my shoulder as cold as the grave, and I flinched away with a cry, stumbling forward. My hands hit the cold, flat surface of the tombstone. I swept my arm across it, sending the items clattering to the stone floor. I heard the vial shatter, the bone skittered away into the darkness. I fumbled for the wooden bird, my fingers closing around its smooth, cold shape. "You cannot stop it," the voice hissed in my mind. "The bargain must be kept. The gate must be sealed." A gate? Michael had never mentioned a gate. He spoke of a bargain, a tithe. What was this thing talking about? "This town is not a cage," the presence clarified, showing me an image in my mind's eye. Not a memory, but a concept. I saw the valley of Sorrow's Hollow, not from the ground, but from above, from an impossible height, and I saw that the town, the woods, the mine, the river, they formed the bars of a vast cage. The roads leading in were the hinges. The church was the lock, but it wasn't a cage to keep something in. It was a seal, a cork in a bottle, and what was in the bottle was ancient, terrible, and wanted out. The sacrifices, the tithes of sorrow weren't food, they were mortar. They were spiritual grout, reapplied every generation to reinforce the crumbling walls of the seal. Elias and Sarah weren't meals, they were patches on a failing dam, and I was meant to be the masterstroke, a keystone of guilt so massive it would secure the seal for another century. The entity's purpose was not to consume the town. Its purpose, its entire existence, was to maintain the seal. It was a warden, a terrifying, inhuman warden, and it used the town's own sin as its tool. The Whistler's tune wasn't a call to feast, it was a call to work. A foreman's whistle calling the crew to repair a breach, and the breach was me. My arrival, my sorrow, my investigation. I hadn't just uncovered the secret, I had destabilized the entire structure. My refusal to be the sacrifice was cracking the very foundations of the prison. The humming in the crypt stopped. It was replaced by a deep, guttural cracking sound, the sound of immense pressure on ancient stone. A faint, sickly green light began to emanate from the spiral on the tomb. It was widening, the lines of the spiral separating, like a tearing wound. "You fool!" the warden entity shrieked in my mind, a sound of pure cosmic panic. "You are breaking the lock! You will undo us all!" The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had two choices, both of them monstrous. I could submit, I could become the sacrifice, pour my guilt and my life into the seal and save this miserable, complicit town from the hell it was holding back. I would be damned, my soul used as psychic cement, but the world would be safe, or I could refuse. I could live. And in doing so, I would break the seal and unleash whatever biblical horror was imprisoned beneath Sorrow's Hollow. The lives of a few dozen guilty, wretched people versus whatever was clawing at the other side of that gate. It was a trolley problem from the depths of hell. My entire life, I had been a watcher, a journalist. I reported on the actions of others. I chronicled consequences. I never chose, I never acted. My one decisive act, getting behind the wheel of a car drunk, had ended in tragedy. Now I was being forced to make a choice that would echo for eternity. What was the life of Arthur Penhaligon, a broken, guilt-ridden man, worth? Weighed against what? I didn't know what was behind the gate, but the warden's terror was clue enough. The air in the crypt was now thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something metallic and alien. The green light from the tomb pulsed faster, brighter, and the cracking sound was coming from all around me, from the walls, from the ceiling. The church was breaking apart. I thought of Brody, a man trapped by his ancestry. I thought of Martha, her face a mask of grief. I thought of the miners, sacrificed by their boss. They were all complicit, all stained, but were they evil? Or were they just terrified people born into a prison and doing what they must to survive? And what of the world outside Sorrow's Hollow? The world that had no idea of the bargain struck here, of the sentinel that slept beneath this ground. To save myself, I would be condemning millions, billions to a fate I couldn't even imagine. My hand was still clutching the wooden bird, the effigy, the tool of transference. Michael's plan was to transfer the mark to me. The original ritual was to transfer it to an object to be destroyed. But what if there was a third option? What if I could transfer the lock itself? I looked at the widening, glowing spiral on the tomb. The lock, the focus of the warden's power. It was failing because its anchor, me, was refusing to be set. But what if I gave it a new anchor? Not a soul, but a story. The story I was living. I was a journalist, a storyteller. It was the only thing I had ever been good at. The thought was madness, born of desperation and a mind stretched to its breaking point. But it was the only thought I had. I stumbled back to the tomb, the green light bathing me in its nauseating glow. The cracking of stone was deafening. Dust and pebbles rained down from the ceiling. I held the wooden bird aloft. "You want an anchor?" I screamed into the chaos, my voice raw. "You want a story of sorrow to seal your gate? I'll give you one, but it won't be my soul. It will be the tale itself." I placed the bird back in the center of the glowing, fractured spiral. I closed my eyes, not in submission, but in concentration. I didn't pour my guilt into it. I poured the narrative into it. The arrival in the rain, Elias Thorne's disappearance, the journal, the sanatorium, Dr. Crane's terror, the mine disaster, Michael's betrayal, the choice. I poured every word, every image, every feeling of dread and discovery into that small wooden object. I was writing the story, my story, onto the very fabric of the ritual. I recited the lullaby, but I changed the final verse, my own words torn from the depths of my screaming mind. "Upon this stone the stories sleep, a promise that the words will keep. Take this tale, the root sleeper deep, and give me all the world to reap from your salvation." The moment the words left my lips, the energy in the room shifted. The warden's presence, which had been panicked and angry, became confused. It was being offered an anchor, a powerful one, rich in the sorrow and fear it craved. But it was not a soul. It was a concept, a self-perpetuating narrative. The cracking stopped. The green light flared, blindingly bright, and a wave of force erupted from the tomb, throwing me back against the far wall. My head struck the stone with a sickening thud, and the world dissolved into a cacophony of shattering sound and blinding light. My last conscious thought was not of fear, or of Amelia, or of the hell I may have just unleashed. It was of the wooden bird, sitting in the heart of the light, no longer an effigy, but a vessel. A vessel for a story, and I realized with a sudden chilling clarity that the ritual had worked. The mark had been transferred, the gate was being sealed, but the anchor wasn't me, it was the story itself, a story that now had to be told over and over again to keep the lock secure. I woke up to the sound of birdsong. Not the carved, silent kind, but the real thing. Sunlight, warm and golden, streamed through a gaping hole in the crypt ceiling. The air was fresh, smelling of morning dew and damp earth. The church above was a ruin, its central spire having collapsed inward, tearing a hole through the floor and into the crypt below. I was lying on a pile of rubble, bruised and battered, but alive. The tombstone was still there, but it was inert. The spiral was just a carving in stone, the green light gone. The wooden bird was gone. The bone shard, the shattered vial, all gone. It was over. I had survived. I had made a choice. I had rewritten the ending. I stumbled out of the ruins of the church into the morning light. The town of Sorrow's Hollow was different. The oppressive grey pall that had hung over it was gone. The sun shone brightly. People were emerging from their houses, not with fear, but with a dazed, confused wonder like waking from a long nightmare. They looked at the ruined church, then at the sky, then at each other. Sheriff Brody stood in the middle of the street, his hat off, his face upturned to the sun, tears streaming down his face. He saw me, and for a moment his eyes held a flicker of recognition of the terror from the night before. But then it was gone, replaced by a simple, weary gratitude. He didn't know what I had done. None of them did. They only knew that the weight had been lifted. The hunger was gone. I found Father Michael, or the man who had been Michael, huddled by the old town well, weeping, not with the calculated piety of before, but with the genuine soul-shattering grief of a man who has lost his God. His purpose, the ancient duty of his family, had been rendered obsolete in a single night. The warden was quiet. The seal, for now, was holding, anchored by a new form of sacrifice. Not a soul, but a story. My story. I didn't speak to him. There was nothing left to say. I walked to the edge of town, to the road that led out. I didn't look back. I had given Sorrow's Hollow its salvation. I had taken its curse and transformed it, or so I thought. As I passed the faded town sign, I felt a familiar, cold weight in my coat pocket. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a small black wooden bird with a single white eye. It felt warm in my hand, as if it held a spark of life, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than the crypt ever had, that the story was now mine to carry. The seal would only hold as long as the story was told, as long as the sorrow was shared. I had not escaped the ritual. I had become the ritual. The second great twist. I was no longer a journalist investigating a story. I was the high priest of a new faith, and my gospel was the very horror I had just survived. The world was safe, but I was damned to be its storyteller, to find new listeners, new readers, and in the telling, to reinforce the lock, to feed the warden with second-hand sorrow. I was the new anchor, and my prison was the entire world. The years that followed were a long, gray echo of that night. I left Sorrow's Hollow behind, but its shadow stretched long and thin, tethered to my soul. I tried to return to my old life, to the world of deadlines and bylines, but the words were hollow, the stories meaningless. How can you report on a city council zoning dispute when you know that the very ground beneath the world is a thin crust over a screaming cosmic abyss? How can you write about human greed and folly when you have looked into the eyes of a hunger that is geological in scale? The real story, the only story that mattered, was locked inside me, a radioactive core I could neither share nor discard. The wooden bird became my constant companion. I kept it in a locked box, but its presence was a palpable weight. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I would hear a faint, almost imperceptible whistling coming from the box. The lullaby, a soft, ghostly reminder of my eternal duty. The peace I had bought for Sorrow's Hollow was conditional. The anchor I had created, the narrative, was not static. It was like a radioactive isotope, decaying over time. The power of the story faded with memory. The seal weakened. I could feel it as a subtle shift in the world around me, a creeping wrongness at the edges of things, a general darkening of the public mood, an increase in despair, in random violence, in quiet desperation. The warden was stirring. The ground was growing thirsty again. I began to understand the true nature of my curse. I was not just the keeper of the story, I was its vector. The ritual I had performed had not ended the cycle, it had merely changed its mechanism. The Finch family had fed the warden's souls. I had to feed it belief. I had to make others feel the dread, the sorrow, the terror. Their fear would become the new mortar for the seal. My first attempts were clumsy. I wrote the story as fiction, a gothic horror novel. It was rejected by every publisher. Too bleak, they said, too unrelenting. The antagonist is a concept, the ending is a philosophical trap. Nobody wants to read this. They didn't understand. It wasn't meant to be read, it was meant to be felt. It was a weapon disguised as a book. I tried other avenues. I started a blog, posting the story in fragments anonymously. It garnered a small cult following, people who were drawn to its oppressive atmosphere. They called it masterful cosmic horror. They praised my world building. They had no idea they were looking at a blueprint. But it wasn't enough. The small drips of fear I was generating were not enough to placate the vast hunger of the warden, not enough to silence the growing rumbling from beneath the world's crust. My dreams became more insistent. I was back in the crypt, but this time, I wasn't the victim. I was standing where Michael had stood, looking down at a kneeling figure shrouded in shadow. I was the shepherd, and the warden's voice in my head was no longer panicked or angry. It was patient, instructive. It showed me things. It showed me the true history of the seal. It was not just under Sorrow's Hollow. There were other locks, other gates scattered across the globe, each with its own culture, its own rituals, its own wardens. Uluru in Australia, the Black Forest in Germany, Aokigahara in Japan. Places of profound natural power or immense human suffering. Places where the veil was thin and all the seals were failing. The collective despair of the modern world was a solvent, eating away at the ancient bargains. The Warden of Sorrow's Hollow was just one of many, and it had made a new bargain with me. My unique story, the story of a man who faced the choice and rewrote the rules, was more potent than the simple brutish sacrifices of old. It was a new kind of energy, and the warden wanted me to spread it. The final horrifying truth was revealed to me not in a dream, but in a moment of quiet contemplation, staring at my own reflection in a rain-streaked window. I had been so focused on my choice in the crypt, on my victory, that I had missed the most obvious and terrible fact, the lullaby. One soul of sorrow, steeped in sin, to call the hungry dark within. Elias Thorne was a broken drunk. Sarah Peters was a runaway from an abusive past. I was a man who had killed a child through his own negligence. We were all perfect catalysts. But my investigation, my relentless digging, my confrontation with Brody, my discovery in the sanatorium, I had done more than just uncover the town's sins. I had amplified them. I had agitated the despair, stirred the pot of misery until it boiled over. Elias and Sarah hadn't vanished just because the 50-year tithe was due. They vanished because my presence, my sorrow, my relentless questioning had acted as an accelerant, waking the warden prematurely and with a ravenous appetite. I wasn't just the investigator who stumbled upon the horror. I was the catalyst that initiated the final, terrible sequence of events. The entire tragedy, from the moment I arrived, had been orchestrated by my own guilt. I was not a hero who made a tough choice. I was the unwitting villain of the entire piece, the final twist of the knife, delivered by my own hand years later. This realization broke the last of my resistance. My purpose was clear now, stripped of all nobility or heroism. I was a tool, an instrument of a necessary, terrible cosmic balance. My guilt was not a flaw. It was my primary function. I moved to a remote cabin, deep in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest, a place that felt old and watchful. I set up a small soundproofed room. I bought high-quality recording equipment. If the story had to be told, I would tell it properly. I would craft it, hone it, imbue it with every ounce of terror and regret I possessed. I would make it a perfect vessel, a voiceover, slow, deliberate, deep, a voice that would carry the weight of the crypt, the chill of the sanatorium, the smell of the damp earth, a voice that would slide under your skin and plant a seed of cold dread in your soul. I structured the narrative, the one you have just heard. I broke it down, just as the warden showed me in my dreams. The introduction to the town, the slow burn investigation, the shocking betrayal, the impossible choice, and the final crushing revelation. A perfect trap for the listener's empathy, a perfect conduit for their fear. And here we are, at the end. You have listened, you have followed me into the dark, you have felt the chill, you have seen the shadows, you have heard the lullaby in the back of your mind, you have shared my sorrow, you have felt my guilt, you have participated in the ritual. The story is no longer just mine, it now lives in you. The seal is reinforced, the warden is placated for a time, the world is safe for another day. I have done my duty. I have passed the burden on. I have made you an accomplice. I look at the wooden bird sitting on my desk beside the microphone. It seems darker now, more solid. Its single white eye seems to look at me with a kind of satisfaction. My work is done, for now. But the story is a hungry thing. Its power will fade, the seal will weaken, and the story will need to be told again. Perhaps next time it will be told by someone else. Someone who heard a voice in the dark and felt a story take root in their soul. Someone like you. So listen. Listen to the quiet places in your world. Listen for a faint, whistling tune on the wind. It's no longer confined to the woods of Sorrow's Hollow. I've given it wings. It's a lullaby for a sleeping world, a world that must never ever be allowed to wake up. And if that song should ever find its way into your dreams, remember my story. Remember the choice, and for God's sake, do not answer. I have told you this story to pass the curse along. Now it is yours.